being debated will be that we should abolish foster care. So without any further ado, I call on the first affirmative speaker, Richard Keys, to begin their team's case.
Woo!
Madam Speaker, on the affirmative, we think it's absolutely appalling when children are shipped between homes without any long-term stability in their living arrangements. That is exactly what we see happening under the foster care system, where some of the most vulnerable children in our society do not have any stability in their familial relationships or the relationships with their foster parents. So what we propose is that, first of all, we would intend to abolish foster care, obviously. Our first step in the alternative would be to intervene directly in the families where foster care may be considered. So these are families where perhaps there's a gambling addiction or a drinking problem and things like that, where we think we can maybe resolve those issues and help those families to fix those issues. In the interim, or if that fails, we would seek out family members to try and take on the care of those children rather than shipping them off to a foster parent. We recognise that this is the status quo for children under the age of 10 in some states already, so we're happy to use that mechanism that is already working of ensuring that families care for those children to make sure that applies to all children under the age of 18. Finally, if both of those systems fail, we would put them in the state system and try to find them adoptive parents. We think that that is a lot better because those parents get those children for life and can't shift those children around amongst themselves, meaning that those children get some stability in their homes. So what is foster care, Madam Speaker? We see that foster care is often what happens to children from families with trouble, and so whether that's gambling or some other form of addiction or abuse. What happens is that those children are removed from those families and put in the state system. They then get a foster parent who looks after that child for a while and they get some money to help cover the cost of that child. But we also recognise that that foster parent can change their mind about caring for that child at any point during that relationship. So that forces that child back into the system to find a new adoptive family or foster family. So what we think that this creates is it creates no focus on fixing the family that had the troubles in the first place, but it also creates no focus on the long-term stability for that child and what is better for that child in the long term. So what should the state try to secure for vulnerable children? We think that primarily vulnerable children require two things, Madam Speaker. They require, firstly, a stable home. We think this is because it is good for their development if they're not being shifted around between different areas and different suburbs, if they're not constantly changing schools and having to make new friends. It's possibly, we think that makes it a lot easier for that child to have a better future. Secondly, we think that a child needs strong family bonds, because we think that bonds between siblings and families are what make you emotionally stable generally. So if you can have a strong bond with a sibling, we would rather you were able to keep that bond with your sibling rather than you both get shifted off to different foster families. We recognise that foster care fails in providing a stable home in the long term for these children and providing familial bonds for a lot of these children. So who are foster parents, Mr. Speaker? Oh, Madam Speaker, pardon me. We recognise that there are various types of people who might choose to be foster parents. So in the first case, and we think that this is probably the majority, they are well-meaning people who want to look after children. We think that that's a really good, altruistic thing that these parents want to do, but we don't think they're able to properly assess this, strain that is going to place on them personally, and whether they will change their mind about these things in the future. So a lot of these well-meaning parents may get more, children from a more troubled background who may be harder for them to cope with, than they thought otherwise, which may mean that in the end they realise they weren't able to cope with that child and the child goes back to the system. Apart from that, we recognise that these well-meaning parents may just change their mind generally at some point in the future. So they may decide to go overseas for 6 months and then they leave that child and that child has to go and get a different family. Or things like they may decide to start their own family, something that they may think that they would struggle to do with their foster child. Secondly, we think that parents who enter this system may be parents who are just doing it for the cash incentives rather than for any particular care for the child. So we think that these people use the pension that they get from the state to help look after these children on their own income and on their own means rather than looking after the child. That means that that child gets no better outcomes out of this foster parent. Finally, we recognise that there are, of course, exploitative parents within this foster system. So we think that any system that shifts around children to totally random families that those children have no bonds with means that those children are in a position where they could be sexually abused, and there is likely to be people who may wish to sexually abuse children wanting to exploit that system. So we think that in that situation, that creates huge problems for those children because it breaks down their ability to trust people in the long term and for the future, and they get sexually abused, which is obviously a huge harm in itself, and that's something that we want to stop. So how do we provide a stable home under the affirmatives model, Madam Speaker? Because what we recognise is under the status quo, some children are lucky, and some children do find foster parents who look after them for 10 years, and they form a really good relationship with that foster family. We don't think that's the majority of children, though, Madam Speaker. What we see is that most people actually get continually shifted around in this system and get new parents all the time as their foster parent circumstances change, which mean that they're no longer able to care for those children. So why do we think that these children are shunted around? Firstly, we recognise that children are often granted a label by the system. So if you are more recognised as a troubled child, you're often assigned a category between 1 and 10. If you get a category 1, that means that you are a troubled child, and that means that parents are less likely to want to look after you for long periods of time. Secondly, we think well-meaning parents change their mind, as I said earlier, and that shifts people around in the system. A huge harm that we recognise from this is that it means that these children can't get things like a stable education because they can't stay in the one school or the one school area for the rest of their lives, which they could if they were able to stay with their families or a longer-term adoptive parent rather than a foster parent. So that means that their long-term development is harmed in that way. So that's why we don't think foster care provides a stable home, whereas adoptive parents or shifting to families does provide a stable home. Secondly, how do we rehabilitate families and ensure family bonds for these children? Because we think that the end game, wherever possible, should be to have children who are from families with issues stay in permanence in a fixed family relationship, whether that be their own family or that be an adoptive parent or with their uncle or auntie or something like that. We think that this is because family bonds are essential for determining the extent to which you can trust people in the future and your emotional development. In that if you can have a good brother or sister that you have a really good relationship with, that increases your ability to trust people in the long term, and that is something that we're willing to stand for. Madam Speaker, we recognise that foster families do not provide stable families for the most vulnerable children in our system. We think the best way to do that is through orphanages or forcing parents and families to look after their children better. We proudly oppose.